Hi everybody, it's Dr. Sturts, and the reason for the screen recording is I'm going to show you how to do part of our week 2 assignment in MGM316. So this is the week 2 assignment where our instructions are to go to a website, compare 3 countries, and then write about some of what we're comparing with the 3 countries. And so this part of the recording will just talk about the website, how to use the website, and then each of the cultural dimensions. So you can see there that the website address is already in the screen. There's also just a link you can click on in the course room to go to this website. So we're going to go to the website, and then you can see once we hit the website that we're asked to compare some countries. And so if you remember, our 3 countries are China, Mexico, and the United States. And so using this website, I could just type in the names of each of the 3 countries and put them each on our chart. So I'm going to do that so you can see what I'm doing here. So you can see now that on the chart we've got China in the blue, Mexico in the purple, and then we have United States in green. So that's the start. Now if I want to learn a little more about each of the countries with respect to the dimensions, you can see if I scroll down a little bit, there's a link here to read more about the chosen countries. So I'm just going to click on that, which takes me to another page where I'm comparing the countries now, but then there's also additional information. So you can see we still have the chart with the dimensions on each of the countries listed, but now there's information about each of the countries that I can click on. You can see it starts with China, since that's the first country that I selected. I can also click and go over to Mexico or the United States. So we'll just do China since that's our first country that I chose. And remember, there's these 6 dimensions. There's power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty, avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence. So these are our 6 dimensions using this cultural insights model. And the activity is to look at each of these and write about if we were opening a business in these new countries, how that might affect our communication and the way in which we communicate. That's the kind of the entirety of the project. So let's kind of scroll down and talk about each of these in some detail. So power distance, what we really are talking about with respect to power distance is the levels in which different members of society are comfortable dealing with and interacting with people at different levels in the organization, different hierarchies. So as an example, power distance might be something like, in some countries, people who are junior in a company are fairly comfortable talking with the president or the CEO, and in other countries, people who are junior are not at all comfortable talking with people higher in the organization. So let's look at this power dimensions chart. I'm going to scroll back up there, and we can see this power distance is on the first dimension. So people in Mexico and China have relatively high power distance, and people in the United States have relatively low power distance. So what does that mean? That means that dealing with team members in the United States, they're more comfortable dealing with or talking to senior people in the organization, whereas people in China might be less comfortable talking with people higher in the organization. And so that can affect the ways we communicate and plan communications. Just something as simple as if one of our ideas is to send our CEO to these 2 countries to talk to the people in the organization, well, the people in the organization based on power distance may be less likely or less comfortable talking to the CEO than would be people in the United States. So that's power distance and an example of power distance. Let's go on to the next one. This is individualism. And really what we're talking about here is the ways in which people tend to think about larger society versus themselves. So in countries with high individualism, people are more concerned or more interested in themselves and their immediate family and their immediate sort of group, and less concerned about the larger society. So in individual societies, we might think less about what benefits society and more about what benefits us. So let's go back to our chart. Since we've got the individualism, we're going to go back up to our chart, and you can see that according to our chart, Mexico and China have relatively low individualism, and the United States has relatively high individualism. So what does that mean? That means in Mexico and China, people are a lot more concerned about what benefits society or benefits the whole group, and less concerned about what benefits them as individuals or their immediate sort of group of influence. So here, this is just a matter of understanding this, and let's say that we're continuing with our example of the coffee franchise expanding into Mexico and China. We probably, when we think about how to communicate with people and how to talk to people in these countries with relatively low individualism, we can think in terms of making sure that we talk about how our expansion plans will benefit larger society or larger groups and not just the individual. Whereas in the United States, we might want to do more emphasis on how the plan will benefit the individual and the individual's immediate group of influence. So that's really the topic of individualism. So let's kind of scroll down to masculinity. And as I scroll, I also want to mention that this is what you'll do for the project yourself, right? You'll go through this, look at this, and understand, think about this, and think about how it applies to your project. So masculinity. So this dimension is really, according to our Cultural Dimensions website, it talks about a high masculine score, really talks about competition, achievement, and success, whereas a low score talks about quality of life and caring for others. So although you'll see in just a minute that our three countries in kind of that we're concerned about have about the same score, there are countries that have relatively low masculinity scores, and these countries can be, have, for example, great social programs to make sure that everyone in society is taken care of. So some of the Nordic countries, such as Finland and Sweden, Norway, these countries tend to have relatively low masculinity scores, or call them feminine scores, and they also tend to have higher quality of life. But so let's kind of go up and look at how this dimension might affect our expansion into China and the United States. Okay, so there's masculinity. You can see here that all of the countries, China, Mexico, and the United States, have about the same masculinity scores. So, and they're relatively high, which means that people in these countries are all going to be motivated by competition, success, winning, that sort of thing. They're all about the same. And so we can think, okay, well, that particular dimension probably does not have a lot to do with our project. Okay, so let's kind of scroll on down now to uncertainty avoidance. So I'm just going to keep going here. Oops, sorry about that. All right, there we go. There we go. Okay, so uncertainty avoidance, really what we're talking about here is to the extent to which people in culture might be uncomfortable with kind of an unknown future. And of course, to a lot of extent, the future is unknown to us all, but especially in business, we can do a lot of things to understand probable outcomes. And so really what we're talking about with uncertainty is by starting a new enterprise or a new business or expanding into new countries like we are with the coffee franchise, that can involve a great deal of uncertainty and people could be uncomfortable. And so we're really thinking about how will this affect us in these different countries. So let's go back up to our chart and have a look. So you can see that there is some differences in uncertainty avoidance. In the United States, it's relatively high, and in Mexico and China, it's relatively low. So what that means is we're going to have to alter our communication according to the comfort or discomfort people are with uncertainty, and think about how this dimension might affect communications with respect to our coffee franchise plan. Okay, so the next one is long-term orientation. So let's kind of go back down and look at what long-term orientation means and how that might affect our project. So the long-term orientation really is talking about countries that have low long-term orientation kind of want to do things the way that they've always done things, whereas countries with relatively high long-term orientation are more likely to embrace change. So let's look at how our chart kind of shakes out with long-term orientation. Aha, you can see China has really high long-term orientation, and then our other two countries have relatively, United States and Mexico have low long-term orientation. So here, this is going to mean that folks in China are a lot more likely to embrace this kind of change that we're talking about, whereas in the United States and Mexico, it may be harder to implement change. And so that will also affect our communication in some real ways. So now let's look at this last dimension, which is indulgence. So let's kind of roll on down here. Our last one's at the bottom. So indulgence really is talks about how likely that people are to kind of indulge themselves. And so what we mean here is people in the United States, for instance, might be a lot more likely to engage in indulgence and maybe spend for today and not save to tomorrow. Maybe we've seen that certainly in our society. And China, in other words, for example, is more likely to be restrained and more likely to be planning for the future. So let's look at our chart, and you can see that China has the low score on indulgence. Looks like Mexico actually has a higher score than the United States, and then the United States is still pretty high. So this dimension also can affect our the way in which we communicate as we think about our coffee franchise. So I hope this video has been helpful to kind of think through how to use the website that we're talking about with respect to the week 2 assignment, and also then how to incorporate some of these ideas into your project.